Still here with the beautiful Gretchen Roderick. Hopefully you're enjoying her insights. I enjoy them on a daily basis. In an earlier video, Gretchen was talking about some of the challenges that she faced when she was on the mission field, and one of them that she mentioned was culture shock and culture fatigue. And so I want to explore that a little bit more. Tell me a little bit more. What did culture shock look like? What did culture fatigue look like? How did that play out daily?
For everybody, it plays out differently. I think there's a lot based on our personalities and our strengths and our weaknesses. And one of the things that I think contributes to culture shock, being like, if you will, overwhelmed or surprised by, or just even becoming angry and frustrated with the different living circumstances and the different customs and the different ways of doing regular business. But as you enter in, you're entering in having no knowledge, no understanding. So although you may be, educated with all sorts of degrees and have had all sorts of life experiences, as you enter into this new place, you don't know the language. You're sometimes, you don't even know how to use a bathroom. Depends on where you are, or how to eat the food, or what to cook, and that. So you go in as a kindergartner, preschooler, and sometimes that's pretty overwhelming. So just kind of contending with that, but also as people deal with circumstances and situations in a culture from a different perspective, you're lost and you have no way of knowing or understanding, how do I deal with this? What's going on? Are people angry with me? Are they happy? Am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the wrong thing? And sometimes, again, I would just want to reiterate that culture shock and culture fatigue are not sin in and of themselves. It is what we do and how we respond in the midst of that. So I confess I was pretty hot in the sin category, still am. But the idea of, in India, when we were there, the first place we lived, the water situation was dry. There wasn't any. And there was nothing in my worldview that could lay hold of the fact that my house didn't have any water. That there was no water in the well. There was no water in the tank. There was no water anywhere to be had. And I thought that the helper that was given to us, the keeper of the house, I thought it was his fault. And I kept blaming him and being so angry with him. And it took, I confess sadly, years for me to actually recognize that. But that also helped to just put those early years into a perspective. And so that culture shock, again, we respond in different ways, and it's important for us to really know who we are and what we're about in order to be successful through the ministry of the Holy Spirit at work within us in overcoming the shock that we experience. And so the fatigue element comes in as we have lived in the culture for a while and you're adjusted to what's going on around you, but still there's an element where it will always remain foreign to you. And so you just become frustrated and frustrated and frustrated with the way you have to go in and buy a stamp at the post office, or whatever. It's the littlest things. And so
I remember taking all day to get a check written.
Yeah. And it's just like, really, why? What's going on? And so you get weary and you get worn down. So again, being in that position, the benefit actually of both culture shock and culture fatigue is that we can humble ourselves before the Father and seek His face for the strength and the wisdom and the insight, for the grace and the peace and the mercy that we need to walk through those in a way that reflect His glory and His love to the world that we are ministering to.
Well, thanks. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for being so honest. In today's lesson, we're going to be looking more detailed at what does it mean to be in culture shock, what does it mean to be in culture fatigue, and what does it mean to be in reverse culture shock. But not just that, we're going to talk about what are some things that you can do when you find that is your reality. Welcome back to our week of focus on the missionary family. In our first lesson this unit, we talked about some of the issues you're going to need to consider or that missionary families need to consider. What is it like to be a single in this culture? How am I going to talk to people? Where am I going to go to church? Who will be my family? All of those questions kind of come together and land on your heart and on your head as culture shock. Most people who travel have been prepared for culture shock. The fact that where you're going is going to be very different from where you are. And people who experience culture shock have some similar patterns. And we're going to talk about those patterns today of just not knowing how to do anything, feeling hopeless and helpless and worthless and frustrated, and what happens to your heart, your mind, your spirit, and your soul as you enter into a new community. Most people work through a set of 4 stages as they're working through culture shock, and they feel like they're falling off a crumbling cliff. But not at first. At first, they're going to feel like they're in the honeymoon stage. This stage is overwhelmingly positive. Everything is new and exciting. One danger of this stage is that people often come on a short-term visit and never get past the honeymoon part, so they think that they don't have culture shock and everything is wonderful. They go back to their home culture to prepare to return as a career missionary with the assumption that all will be well and everything is going to be sunshine and roses when they come back to serve for a longer period of time, and then they experience the rest of culture shock. That begins when they enter into the frustration stage, when they begin to feel confusion, anger, sadness, homesickness. A common question is, why did I ever come here? I must have misunderstood. God wouldn't want me to be this unhappy. I remember my missions professor talking about his days in Hong Kong, lying in bed with the covers pulled over his head, refusing to leave his house. At this point, even the smallest annoyances can be magnified into major issues. Outbursts of emotion are not uncommon. As a side note, that's one of the reasons it's a good idea to do your language study in a city other than the one you plan to stay in for your longer-term ministry, so that if you do have a meltdown and offend people, they're not people that you're going to be partnering with on a daily basis for years. But that frustration stage does not last forever. It is followed by a recovery or an adjustment period. This process of adaptation helps you understand the new normal. What once seemed very odd and incomprehensible begins to appear normal. Some things even begin to make sense. Patterns emerge, and for some things you actually prefer the new way of thinking or acting. I will never forget the day we had been in South India, living in the city of Hyderabad for about a year. I was sitting in an auto rickshaw. I was at a corner surrounded by all kinds of shops and noises and people and vehicles, and I looked around and I thought, everything seems normal. And I realized that a year ago, I'd never even heard of most of this stuff. That process of beginning to adjust, this is what normal is like, will finally come, and then that can lead to acceptance. This final stage of acceptance is when you make peace with this being the way things are. That doesn't mean that you necessarily agree with everything, just like you didn't like everything about how life worked back at home, but you learn to accept that it is the way things are, and you're able to move forward. Sometimes, instead of culture shock, or in addition to culture shock, people experience culture fatigue. We say that culture shock is when everything surprises you. Culture fatigue is when it's no longer surprising, it's just what you expected, and you're sick of it. You want things to go back to the way that they used to be. Culture shock is not a simple, straightforward, one-and-done process. It's a moving forward, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back kind of process that can be very exhausting. And when you are in this, there are certain characteristics that will be true of you or are true of very many people. There are some symptoms of culture shock that might help you recognize what's going on. You get mad easily, and that often expresses itself as criticism of the culture and the people. You're always complaining about the way that they do everything. Why can't they do things right? And by right, of course, you mean the way that people in your home country do. Constant complaints about the weather, always finding a reason to stay inside, missing meetings and social events, not even going grocery shopping. Very, very unhappy. You become preoccupied with home, either wanting to return home or suddenly having a passion for baseball when you never watched a baseball game before in your life, or some product, a pressing desire to talk to people who, quote unquote, really make sense, people who get me. People who are in culture shock are often germophobic to the max, worried about the purity of water and food. They're afraid to touch people or doorknobs, using gallons and gallons of hand sanitizer. There's a rejection of everything about the culture, a refusal to learn language or to engage the culture in any way. Or the opposite can be true, an over-identification with the new culture and a rejection of self and of home. So these are just some of the things that can happen when a person is in culture shock. I would encourage you, if you're looking at a career overseas, to print this list out, stick it on your refrigerator. After about a month in your new country, you'll walk by, see the list and say, that sounds familiar. Really, you probably won't even acknowledge it, but when you do, when you recognize, I think my problem is I'm in culture shock. That's why I'm so depressed. That's why I'm so angry all the time or so wound up. That's why I always think I'm going to be robbed or cheated or caught in an accident. It clicks in. You have this moment of clarity. What can you do to help you process through that culture shock? Well, first, you can learn as much as possible about your new home before you leave. A great series of books are the Culture Shock books. It's Culture Shock : and then the name of a country. We learned a lot about India when we read the Culture Shock India book. One of my favorite parts was there was a quiz in the back to see if you grasped everything they had to teach you. And there was a question: if you see a single headlight coming at you in the dark, does this mean A, a motorcycle is approaching you, B, a bus is approaching you with one light burned out, or C, a truck with its lights off is attempting to pass a bus with only one light? But just being able to recognize these were some things that we could expect when we got to our new country helped us deal with the shock element. I would strongly encourage you start by reading books from the children's library, simple books that inform you about the new country, and then build up from there. But even once you arrive on the field, keep learning. Watch the news, read magazines, talk to people, continue to be interested in learning about your new country. The more you understand the country, the more you'll begin to understand why they do the things they do the way they do. Again, for me, one of the biggest frustrations with life in South Asia was that nobody would ever stand in line. Nobody was willing to wait their turn. Well, that's because I came from a country of abundance where if I waited my turn, I would get what I needed. A friend finally pointed out to me that in South Asia, that's not guaranteed. The reason they don't wait in line is not because they're greedy or selfish, but because they realize that the last half of the line isn't getting anything, so they need to be aggressive if they want to get their needs met. So keep learning, and you'll begin to understand why people do the things the way they do. Connect your learning to something specific. Find something specific in the culture that you can relate to and learn to love it. Do you like sports and you've moved to a former British colony? Learn to love cricket and follow that. Are you a big movie fan? Check out the local cinema. Learn the stars. Watch the classics. Are you a budding musician? Join a band and learn a local instrument. But find a way to connect a passion you already have to your new environment. Learn the language. I cannot emphasize enough how important learning the language is. It is essential to be an effective missionary that you be able to speak the language of the people. We talked about that in the last video. But it's essential for you to be happy to be able to communicate to people. Learning the language is hard, but it is worthwhile. Doing all of the above will help, but also developing a language route that gets you out of the house and gives you opportunities to build new relationship is just going to be wonderful. Of course, be realistic. Admit that some days are going to be hard and build some cushion into your schedule. Have some margin where you have breathing space. Plan some downtime. Don't go to the opposite extreme. Don't become isolated. That's not what I'm suggesting. But plan a home culture day where you're just going to stay in your jammies, eat comfort food, and watch your favorite movie as a respite before you go back out into the culture. If you have a spouse or kids, realize that they're also going to hit the wall at some point. Hopefully these crashes are going to be staggered and you can help each other through. But either way, find a support network. People who are going to be encouraging, people who are going to check on you, people who are going to be accountable with you for making it through the hard days and celebrating the good days. And then ultimately, lean on God. Only by depending on Him more than you ever have will you be able to progress through this. But that's a win-win. When you get to the other side and reach the acceptance stage, you will be closer to God and closer to your new culture. Guess what? Once you get through culture shock, You're not done, because about that time, it'll be time to have reverse culture shock, where you'll be returning to your country of origin, and it will be almost as strange to you as the country that you moved to in the first place. Reverse culture shock is the same process, but often it's worse because it's unexpected. You think that you're going home and that you know how to be at home, but the reality is you have never been home as the person that you are today. And so, you're going to go through a honeymoon stage where everything is wonderful and everyone's excited to see you and you're happy to reconnect with family and friends and visit the favorite places that you've missed and everything's great and look at all this junk food that I've missed. And then that reverse culture shock of frustration will hit. You will start to feel sad, depressed, angry, critical of your home country. Probably you will experience reverse homesickness. This is very normal because you have become a different person. You will have to work through that same process of recovery. It will take time. Eventually, you will be able to reintegrate into that culture, but you need to recognize, as Craig Storty points out in his book, Coming Home, that coming home is almost impossible considering that you have changed and so has everyone else. You can never go home again. So the best thing that you can do is to prepare for reverse culture shock. What are some of the things that will be challenges for you as you re-enter? Boredom. Living back in your home country may not be as exciting as living abroad was. No one wants to hear about your stories. Even your family and your closest friends may not want to hear everything. When you do explain, you're going to need to be very brief. You're going to want to find people you can confide in about your experiences and explain more. But most people just aren't going to care. And so that's going to become frustrating for you, and you're going to begin to develop a reverse homesickness for people who understand you, people who get you. Just like you missed home when you first moved to a new place, you'll inevitably miss this new place when you return home. I remember one of my stateside assignments, I went to an India cultural fest, found a Pakistani restaurant, was able to talk about a Bollywood movie at a arts council meeting. Those were the highlights for me because I found people who understood my passion for India. When you come back to your culture, you're going to find that relationships have changed. Just like you changed while you were gone, things have also changed at home. We came back to our church and asked about a church member. Where is she? We haven't seen her, only to find out that she had passed away 2 years earlier, and nobody told us. People will get divorced. People will have children. People will be married. People will move away. They don't always remember to let you know what's going on while you're gone. So just expect that re-entry will not be smooth as silk. Just like there are ways that you can deal with culture shock, there are ways that you can deal with reverse culture shock. Accept that you have changed and that things won't be the same as when you left. Don't isolate yourself, but connect to other people in your church, in your community. Take care of yourself physically and mentally. Maintain a healthy diet and exercise. Focus on how you're now better off because of the experiences that you had and because of the things that you have learned, and don't lose the value of those. Don't be upset if people seem indifferent to your experience. They may not want to hear about what happened to you, but that's okay. Prepare to rebuild relationships and not just resume them. You can't just step back in as if nothing ever happened because something happened. Years have happened. Life experiences have happened. Meet with people who have had similar experiences, such as other international students or scholars. Talk with them and share your experiences, your frustrations and joys. Maintain your relationships with your friends that you made while you were living abroad. Be flexible and expect the unexpected. Remember that this helped you get through the difficult times. When you first went through culture shock, those same things are going to help again. Stay international. Read magazines, newspapers, websites from abroad. Get involved with international organizations or clubs. Connect with other internationals. Become a host family for an international student. Become a tour guide or a volunteer in a study abroad office. Teach English as a second language. Share your experiences with others. Volunteer to talk to people who are getting ready to go abroad. If you do return to the same place that you left, as a different person, redefine the place. Take up a new hobby. Involve yourself in a new sport, but in some way make it a new place and not just an old place that seems different. Keep your memories alive. Don't store them in a shoebox, but look at the pictures. Go out and have a good meal from your adopted culture, but maintain that relationship. Let yourself be sad and miss the people and the places that you've lived in, and give yourself time to adjust. Most of all, reflect on your experience, look back on your time, identify the changes that have taken place within yourself, and thank God for walking with you through that journey and all that He led you through. Reverse culture shock is not necessarily a bad thing. It simply means that you have grown as a person. God has taught you something you didn't know and shown you a place you had never been. That's a good thing, so rejoice in that. Hopefully that's been helpful to consider. Probably none of this means a lot right now. Put these notes somewhere you could find them for the day that God calls you to serve in a new culture and for the day that you come back. For the rest of this unit, I want you to do some self-study. There is an article from the Red Cross on managing stress in the field, and then there's a quiz, a stress adjustment scale that will help you understand some of the stressors that are involved in life in general that many times pile up when you're serving cross-cultural ministry-wise. There's a guide for some self-care for missionaries, things that a person can do when they're separated from their home church and support network. I already mentioned that there's also a resource guide for singles. And then there is a forum. After watching these two videos, reviewing the documents, I want you to answer the questions. Imagine that you're going to be serving on the field in 6 to 12 months at home or abroad. What stressors do you think you'll be facing? What coping mechanisms can you put into place when you get there? And what kind of support network could you begin developing now? Look forward to reading your answers. Have a great week. God bless. Just one last question for Gretchen. You talked about culture shock, culture fatigue earlier, some of the different challenges physically that you had while you were serving overseas. What made it all worthwhile?
Jesus. Answering the call, knowing that I was there because that was where I was called to and where God had ordained for me to be. And in the midst of it all, He still chose to use me. In the midst of my sin and culture shock and culture fatigue, He still chose to use me and got to see great and awesome things that the Father was doing because I was where He wanted me to be, endeavoring to live the life that He created me to live. And so that was really, truly the best thing about it is God.
Amen.